This is Jared Svensson.
And this is Joey, Jared's brother, and the pastor.
And this is the pastor with no answers. So, what's 1 plus 1?
I'm not going to answer that question, my friend.
You're not answering because you know the answer, and you know the name of the podcast is absolutely worthless.
Your mom's worthless, dude. Whoa, wait. That doesn't really work here.
Yeah, nice one, dumbass.
Yeah, I just called my mom worthless. That's not cool at all. Well, welcome to the pastor with no answers. The debate continues as to whether or not that name suffices. I'm comfortable with saying I don't have any answers, but, you know, Jared keeps making good points because I know what 1 plus 1 is, but there's probably some postmodern people that would say, you just don't know. How can you prove that 1 plus 1 is 2? Those people just don't deserve to be called humans, I guess. I don't know.
That kind of stuff just drives me nuts. That intense skepticism taken to the nth degree. That irks me.
Yeah, so, hey, just this is probably some dated information, but you know what? When we started this podcast, we actually hit number 2 in the Christian section. Now, that may not seem like a big deal because that's one category, but it's a big deal when you think about all the people that we beat out, such as Rick Warren, Andy Stanley, Joyce Meyer, Mark Driscoll, who still has a podcast that's way up there, David Platt.
Did we ever
Matt Chandler? Joel
Osteen?
No, we did not surpass the pastor with all the answers.
Damn it!
Hey, so anyway, thank you guys for listening. Some of you that listened to the episode on Speaking in Tongues, our good buddy Peter, who you'll be hearing from at some point on this podcast. He actually wrote a post on why he does not speak in tongues, and he actually was a little bit frustrated with that episode in a good way. I'm not knocking him, but just thought that Chip got off the hook a little bit with his approach on speaking in tongues. So anyway, you can go to badchristian.com/PWNA tongues. So that's badchristian.com/PWNA tongues. Read why he doesn't speak in tongues. Go to facebook.com/BC Pastor if you just kind of want to stay in touch with what we're doing and that sort of thing. And Jared, did you know that someone emailed us wanting to give money to this crap?
That defies all logic.
Anyway,
I'll take it.
Yeah, Stephen Mayer. I want to say that I'm saying your last name correctly. Thank you for the love. And my gosh,
definitely.
if anybody wants to go to gumroad.com/PWNABC, then there's some options there. You're not really going to get a whole lot from us other than just you being able to say you support something that you like. But, Jared, we were texting back and forth the other day, and it really started with it had been a while since I had listened to Sunny Day Real Estate, How It Feels to Be Something On, which I still hold to be one of my top 5 favorite albums of all time. And so the conversation just went from there between you and I because I had also revisited it. It's weird. It's like when I hit a new season, I start thinking about a lot of the albums that I listened to in that season dating back 15, 20 years. And 2 albums that hit me big time because I still hold to this day that 1998 and 99 was 2 of the most critical years of my life. We won't go into all the boring details as to why, but
thanks.
Fall of 98, Static Prevails by Jimmy Eat World and How It Feels to Be Something On by Sunny Day Real Estate. For sure, 2 epic albums of that time, and I'm telling you, the nostalgia is just unbelievable. But Jared,
let me ask you real quick though, is that the same season that we purchased or we first listened to the second Pedro the Lion, the one that came on I think Made in Mexico?
Hard to Find a Friend.
Yeah.
Well,
was that fall of 98?
Well, the problem is it came out then, but I didn't get it in the mail until winter of 99.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, it did come out then, but the mail order thing messed up. Hey, isn't that crazy, dude? I had to snail mail write this guy and say, hey, man, I still haven't gotten Hard to Find a Friend. What's the holdup?
Right. Love the 90s, man.
Yeah, dude, and I'm telling you, at some point I just had to say, well, I guess this guy stole my money. because I'm not getting the CD. I'm not hearing back from them, and it's not like I can email them every day. I'm not going to write a letter and waste a stamp every day mailing the guy every single. But anyway, Jared. So Sunday Real Estate, How It Feels to Be Something On, and then Clarity, actually not Static Prevails by Jimmy Eat World are two out of. Go ahead.
No, Clarity came out.
No. I moved the conversation on to my top 5 albums of all time.
Okay.
So Clarity, Jimmy Eat World, How It Feels to Be Something On by Sunday Real Estate, 2 out of my top 5. And I was telling you the other day that most likely This Afternoon's Malady by Jejune, a very obscure album that came out on Big Wheel Recreation back in '98, that was my top favorite album of all time for years and years and years until 6 years until Achilles Heel by Pedro the Lion came out, which is still to this day, 11 years later, my number 1 album of all time. That's Pedro the Lion's Achilles Heel. If you haven't heard it, you got to listen to it. But
I would say I would listen to everything you just mentioned, though. I mean, I think for someone who wants to get a feel for, mid '90s emo, Midwestern emo, you got to check out, Static Prevails. You got to check out Jejune. It's a gorgeous album. It definitely is obscure, but definitely worth hunting down. With the internet nowadays, it's probably super easy to find.
Yeah.
Sunny Day Real Estate, they have at least 3 classics. I mean, I think all 3 of their first albums are amazing. So yeah, they're all worth checking out for sure.
Yeah, and you need to take my Rising Tide dare. I told you that I had revisited the Rising Tide because I agree with you. That's my least favorite Sunny Day. But I listened to it yesterday. I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is good."
Let me ask you this:
good.
Yeah, so one album I do like is the Fire Theft. So would you say the Rising Tide is kind of culminated in the Fire Theft? Are they very closely?
Yeah, I would say the Rising Tide transition, How It Feels to Be Something On, to the Fire Theft, but I don't like the Fire Theft as much as the Rising Tide.
Oh wow, okay.
All right, so hit us up on a handful of your for sure top 5, and then you can throw out some that may make it.
Okay, so for the longest time, I would say Weezer Pinkerton was number 1, but last fall, it shifted to Siamese Dream by Smashing Pumpkins. That's my all-time favorite album. Absolutely amazing album. I mean, Cherub Rock, how it starts off, is crazy good, but start to finish, it's an amazing album. 2, I would have to say The Power of Failing by Mineral, kind of an obscure band, definitely Midwestern emo. I actually saw them live last November in Gainesville at the Fest. It was a crazy cool show. They had broken up for a while, so it was kind of a reunion tour. An amazing album. I would say number 3, probably the Blue Album by Weezer.
Yeah.
And then which is obviously a very popular album. And then probably number 4, I would say Life in General by MXPX.
Nice.
Very very cool, like pop punk, hit after hit after hit on that album. I can listen to that start to finish as well. So top 4. Other ones I like, Get Up Kids 4 Minute Mile is really good. Another mid-90s Midwestern emo. I saw them live back in August with Braid. It was a great show. I also like Rancid, Out Come the Wolves. Very cool ska infused punk from the mid-90s. So those kind of round out my top 5 or 6, I would say.
What's funny is the people that are listening to this podcast that are from the same music generation and have the same interest, they're like, Mineral? Obscure? What in the heck are you guys talking about? That's not obscure. And but the people that thought that Finch and Taking Back Sunday defined emo for what it is, you guys are saying, I've never heard of Mineral. Right. But the biggest irony of all time is you theologians and people that like to debate cultural and theological issues, and you're looking at the description of this podcast and you're like, I must have the wrong podcast. Somebody told me that they talk about really fun biblical cultural issues. Well, you did not run into the wrong podcast. It's just that Jared and I take the first intro to talk about whatever the hell we want to talk about, so you're just going to have to live with that. And we are moving on, though, to a topic of how do you read Genesis. Now, we talk about the Bible and how to read it. In fact, there's a future episode coming out. We just did the conversation with a friend of ours, Dan Koch, from the band Sherwood and Pacific Gold, a friend of Bad Christians, and he has some very interesting viewpoints on this topic, and we actually had someone come on with freaking doctorate's degree teaches this sort of theology, who comes from a very conservative standpoint, infallibility, inerrancy, and all that stuff. So we talk about this stuff all the time just because, honestly, from a Christian perspective, how we approach any and every issue ties to this specific issue. How in the heck do we read the Bible? And so in this conversation that we have here with our friend Ryan Amick, one of my best friends, and Jack Hoey, you have heard him, another close friend of mine. We talk specifically about Genesis, talking about the creation account, Adam and Eve, Noah, and all that stuff. And I think you'll be pretty surprised by the different ways you could potentially read this, but I'm sure some of you will agree and disagree. But we're joining our guest right now.
Ooh, I'm a dummy. I hate myself.
All right, well, we are now with our guest here, and let me set the stage. First of all, Ryan Amick, he was with us for a previous interview that he came prepared for, but Carrie, our KJV friend, was not able to jump on this podcast episode, which deals with Genesis and whether or not it's metaphorical or literal or semi-literal. So I just said, hey, Ryan, why don't you hang around? Our friend Jack's going to be jumping in and talking. And I don't know if Ryan knows anything about the subject. He doesn't know a whole lot about anything, so he has to really prepare, and he's unprepared. So if there seems to be 1/4 of us that just is saying really weird stuff, and, that's why.
Well, luckily for y'all, I happen to be just as passionate as, what's the other guy's name?
Carrie.
As Carrie is about the King James.
As you are about.
Only as I am about the message.
About the message Bible.
Wow.
I think that's the literal translation I got.
So that's what everybody should be reading, is the message.
Exactly.
All right, so welcoming Jack back with us, and we're going to be digging into this question and I do want to say this, that this to me is a very interesting topic. That and this is going to go ahead and count for my 2-minute intro, and then we'll pass the baton. My brother's intelligence with the Bible and all that stuff has been a huge part of my faith. I've learned a lot from him as far as science and how the Bible is interrelated, and I still attribute that to a lot of his knowledge, and I still learn from him. So Jack, who's become a good friend of mine over the last couple years, threw me for a curveball as well, which was super eye-opening. And Jack, this may be stealing maybe your 2-minute intro, and that'll be good because you're kind of
You already stole
anyway.
mine.
Yeah. So, what about you being super smart?
Yeah, exactly. That's it. I'm done.
Jared was going to talk 2 minutes about how smart he is. So Jack told me one time that he is not and Jack, you can tell me if you've changed your mind since, but with Noah and the flood and with the creation account, you're on the fence as to whether or not it's even, I want to say, poetic or actually telling a historical story. So you can totally push back on that if I'm misquoting you. But bottom line is, Jack said something to me that really piqued my interest, and that was that when it comes to the historicity, how do I say that word? Historicity? Hysterectomy of the Bible.
I don't think that's right. That's something else. That's another thing.
So when it comes to that thing of the Bible, you really can only start with Abraham, and that's where history really validates the Bible, is Abraham on. And I was like, daggum. And so now I'm actually totally 100% into Jesus. I love the fact that he lives inside of me. I believe in what he's done for me. But I am okay with, for example, the book of Job not being a non-fiction piece, but rather a fictional piece. We've talked about that a little bit in former episodes. But anyway, that's where I'm at. I don't really care one way or another, but I'm super interested in this topic, and I can't wait to see and hear Jared and Jack get super mad at each other. So let's go to the next dummy on the call, Ryan. So just get this out of the way. Do you have any thoughts on this, Ryan?
I have absolutely no thoughts.
No thoughts on this. So, Jared.
Wait. Ryan, so which... You have to take a side, though. What's your side? Just pick a side.
You have to take a side, Ryan.
Seriously, come on.
It sounds a lot like myth to me. If you want my
The whole Bible?
No, Genesis. Genesis
So
sounds... It's got a lot of elements of myth.
So you can call me the
whether or
Mythbuster
not-
then. Let's do it.
Whether or not God's truth can live inside that, I'm completely fine with. But whether or not it's a historical account of anything, I won't sleep as good on that one.
That whole rib thing gets Ryan, I think. All right, Jared, go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know. Like, to me, it seems like the reason why we don't want to consider Genesis history is because of the paradigm we live in, which totally accepts Darwinism.
All right, stop right there. What is a paradigm?
A paradigm is...
I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Okay. All right, so we're operating under a paradigm where Darwinism is the explanation of all life on Earth. We live in a paradigm where the Big Bang Theory accounts for the universe. So to me, it seems like the only reason why we can dismiss Genesis as history is to accommodate Darwinism and the Big Bang. Okay? Now, as to you're saying that Genesis can't be proven with anything like concrete, I would argue that things like the big flood of Noah, that's actually looked at as catastrophism versus gradualism, or I forgot the other word. But anyway, you have basically two camps. One camp is that the Earth, the universe evolved over billions and billions of years. So the Grand Canyon was carved gradually by water, whereas people who really embrace Genesis as fact would say that Noah's flood, which was global, created very quickly the geography that we see today. Okay. Secondly, many people would probably laugh at Genesis 6 with the Nephilim, but there are giant skeletons being unearthed all the time. Well, not all the time, but historically, 20th century, 19th century in America, South America, Central America, and that really goes well with giants like Goliath and giants that were pre-flood and things like that. So to me, there are actual historical arguments that support the Genesis account. And then lastly, if you dismiss Genesis as just being myth, I think that does give rise, not necessarily for Christians, but the moment you exclude, God as being away from history, as away from science, you can start justifying things like social Darwinism, moral relativism, eugenics, genocide, those kinds of things. Not that Christians would do that, but I think that it's very easy once you dismiss Genesis and just call it myth, then you're saying, okay, well then, how do we explain, the rise of life, the rise of the universe? If it's just Darwinism, where things just kind of come from randomness, then it almost allows us to say that we don't even need a God anymore. And I think that's what's happened post-Darwin is, Western civilization has said we don't need God anymore because Darwin did a great job explaining things without him, and the Big Bang Theory without God as well. So that's where I fall into this whole thing.
That is interesting, man. That is interesting. I'm going to break the rule because it's Jack's turn now, but I think Jesus changes all that. Don't you think? You said that if...
He changes the rules of the podcast or something?
My point exactly.
Yeah. All right, Jack.
Yeah, so, on the one hand, I don't necessarily disagree with anything Jared said. I think, though, that where I run into problems is where it becomes an either-or. So either the Bible is, or rather, let's just focus on Genesis. Either Genesis is history in a way that we mean that word, or it's myth. And I think both of those are kind of fuzzy words. The idea that Genesis is myth, I have no problem with that, because myth does not equal untrue. Myth is a manner of telling stories. We've kind of made it into this thing where myth equals fiction. But myth is also a style, and Joey, earlier you said that I see Genesis 1 as poetry. Well, it is poetry. The question is, what is it communicating? And so, for my part, I would say yes, Genesis is history. But the question is, what sort of history is it? And what is it trying to convey? The problem is we define history in a way that no one did back in the ancient world, whether the time of Moses or the time of Jesus. We treat history very differently. We think that it should be the objective reporting of facts, and we've kind of fooled ourselves into thinking that's even a thing that's possible. Yes, Genesis is history, but what manner of history is it? Genesis is, the whole Bible is about God's role in history. It's about the relationship between God and his people, God and Israel. And Genesis introduces that theme. And it's not so much a question of is it true or not, but how is it introducing that theme? And I think the problem is we try to do things with Genesis 1 that we really ought not do. So if I'm reading a book on physics, and I say to myself, why isn't this addressing my deep-seated questions about depression and suicide? Well, it's not about that. Or if I attend a lecture at a college, right? Let's say Neil deGrasse Tyson is giving a lecture, and it comes time for questions, and I say, yes, Dr. Tyson, I'm sorry, but can you please tell me why do my wife and I continue to have disagreements, even though we so often see things similarly? What is the deal with that? I would be seen as a nuisance, because that's not what the lecture is about. And trying to make it about something it's not is going to take you down a road that you're not going to find anything on, and it's going to be really troubling, and it's going to leave you with a lot of tension. And I think that's what people do with Genesis. So people ask, is Genesis 1 science? Of course it's not science. But it's not supposed to be science. That's not what it was written to be.
You done stepped on some Jared toes.
Well, I mean, science...
No, I'm not going to say this is a science textbook. It's not. It's not a science textbook.
Well, but even science itself, science is a
same...
very specific thing. I mean, science is measured and repeated experiments, right, to test hypotheses. That is in no way anything that Genesis tries to do. And so I think just even using the word science is just a mistake, because it's not what it's trying to do. But that doesn't make it any less true. And I think when we start getting into the whole is the Bible science thing, we are letting other people set the terms of the discussion. Because, Jared, you said something I think is right on, and that is that, essentially in our society, science has sort of become a religion. And the word science has sort of become synonymous with truth in our society. And when we treat the word science that way, it's a big mistake. Because that's not what science itself is. And when we use it that way, it's just we're not going to be able to really have an intelligent discussion about what Genesis is doing, because that's not what it's doing.
So let me ask you this, Jack. I think we're all familiar with whether, literal, non-literal, as far as, okay, were they literally 7 days, or are we talking thousands of years? But do you think there's a chance that the creation account as we read it, two naked people in a garden that's perfect, that a dude named a bunch of animals and ate from a tree that they were allowed to eat from and shouldn't have eaten from another tree, do you think there's a chance that story is completely a metaphor?
Yes. Now, what I'll say, let me say this real quick. What I will say is, of all the things in Genesis, I think that is I think Adam and Eve are the most problematic in terms of once you start talking about this. And I think there's a chance. But, for me, if Adam and Eve are not literal, that raises some really difficult questions for me. And not just because, other people in the Bible, other writers sort of treat them as historical persons, but, just it raises a lot of ethical, moral questions for me about humanity that are probably not relevant.
Because are you saying the alternative of Adam and Eve would be evolution,
Right.
or God creating a bunch of people at different locations in the world? I mean, what if Adam and Eve didn't happen how God said it happened? What are the alternatives?
Well, I mean, sort of what you said. I mean, I think evolution. If you want to say, oh, well, he created a bunch of people at different points in the world, then I mean, why not just say Adam and Eve? It seems like so.
Yeah.
But for me, the deal with evolution, the real problem with evolution and humanity is the question of the image of God. Because if you want to take evolution all the way down, right, at what point does the image of God enter in? Because, we don't believe that animals possess the image of God. And so I think if you want to say that people evolved, at some point I think you have to deal with when did the image of God become imprinted on people. And if you want to say that it happened at a specific point, right? So let's just say there was a guy named Adam, right? And he was a real guy, not the first person, but he, kind of the result of evolution, and he was the point where the image of God entered into people. So that would mean that his parents didn't have it. Well, that's morally icky. I mean, right? So in other words, you have to say that suddenly there are people, and then there are people who are actually more like animals because they don't have the image of God. And to me, that's the most problematic thing about the idea that humans evolved, because the image of God is something that's communicated very clearly in Scripture, and it's something that's very important. And if you want to say that it's always been there, then you have to say that a strain of animals had it all the way back to the beginning. And I don't know that I've found anyone who really gets at that problem, and so for that reason, I kind of feel like I can't really in good conscience say no, Adam and Eve weren't real, because it's such a problem for me that I'm really not at that point where I'm comfortable doing that yet, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
Hey,
Can I say something, Joey? Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, well, let Ryan butt in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Happen that,
Totally,
that
man.
much.
I was just gonna ask what you guys define the image of God as. So just so that we're all arguing from the same point of view.
You're asking Jack or Jared?
Either one.
What's the
Anybody
image of
but
God,
you.
Jack?
Like at Disney World, those like press-a-pennies. So like when you're created, God basically runs your soul through a heavenly press-a-penny, and you have no. That's a hard question. Jared, your turn.
Okay, I mean, I would say body, soul, spirit. I mean, we are. I don't want to say we're a trinity, but I think God created us with those three attributes. That and there's an immortal part of our essence too that I don't think does apply to the animal world. So body, soul, spirit. I mean, I think that those
I think
working together.
the ability. I mean, getting a little more practical, the ability to truly love. I think the ability to have real, true community, making moral judgments or moral decisions. Like, I don't think a lion is thinking, man, this calf was just born and that mom's going to be really sad. So I think, if I eat it right now. So I think just being able to think through morality and all
Conscience
that sort of
too, right?
Basically, what you would define it as is a consciousness.
Yeah.
And in which case, if you do define it as that, where does the problem with Darwin's theory of evolution come in? Because if people were derived from single-celled organisms that slowly over time got more and more organized,
I think the image of God is several things. I guess the main thing the image of God is it's the ways in which we are like Him, right? We're made in His image. And I think Jerry touched on a very important thing: the idea that we're body, soul, and spirit. All of those things together, and all of those are integral to who we are. The physical body is just as important to our being as anything else. It's also ways in which we're like God, and Joe, you kind of touched on that with the ways in which we're able to love, the ways in which he's sort of given us authority as His stewards on the earth. I think there's another thing, which is that it is sort of, and this is probably more of a result than an actual part of the image of God. It means that every person has equal worth and dignity, right? Like the image of God is not something you can erase from yourself. And that's the here in Charleston and around the country, but especially here in South Carolina, the Confederate flag's been in the news a lot, and Russell Moore had a really fantastic post about it. And you know, one of the things he reminded people is that, you know, Christianity really, the idea that you can own another human being is really repellent to Christianity, and it's because of the image of God. It's the idea that people are set apart, and the image of God bestows on them an inherent dignity, and that dignity is stronger than our culture's language of rights. Our culture loves to talk about rights, but the image of God is an infinitely stronger affirmation of human dignity than any sorts of rights language.
I like that. Well put.
All right, so let me
Can I address Ryan's
Jared.
question?
Yeah.
Because I think Ryan was saying, why is Darwinism problematic regarding the image of God, and I think theology, maybe, Ryan? Is that what you were saying? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah.
Well, I
mean,
guess
most of what I'm going to come with today is directly out of a book by Francis Collins, The Language of God. It's the only book I've really read on the subject, so I'm clearly going to be one-sided. But it basically argues that Darwin's theory of evolution and our understanding of a biblical God are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and that our understanding of science can simply be a reflection of God's mechanics, how His power works.
I guess I would argue, yeah, it makes sense. I guess I would argue theologically.
I know that's super vague.
No, it totally makes sense. And I think that's a fair question. I think that if you look at like 1 Corinthians 15, where it says, "For since by man came death," okay, that's implying Adam. I think that Darwinism presupposes that death is the way we got to man. So they definitely conflict. There's conflict there, because for us to get from single cell organism to man, it requires like generations upon generations of death. But the Bible is clearly saying, go ahead.
In my ignorant point of view, I would argue that God is clearly not offended by or even concerned with the idea of physical death, that most of His energy is spent towards spiritual death.
Yeah, but it says, "For since by man came death."
In that case, you could make the argument that the first real death was with the first real consciousness, the person who had free will and could choose God or not.
Well, the only problem with that, though, Ryan, is God originally intended for physical and spiritual life to be eternal. Yeah. So, I mean, but I do see what you're saying as far as a post.
I don't know that I agree with that, though. You say originally intended. There's a difference between originally intended and originally set up. One of the mistakes I think we make is to assume that because things will be a certain way at the end, when God, brings history to a close and reconciles everything to Himself, because we see the Bible say how things will be then, we assume that it was like that in the beginning, and that's not clear from Scripture. And the passages in Romans or 1 Corinthians talk about through one man came death. I think that's really talking about death to men rather than to creation as a whole. I think that, because Paul's kind of larger point is that Christ also brings resurrection. But again, resurrection for people made in the image of God. All creation is reconciled, but that's not the same as resurrection.
Where's the line of demarcation, though? That's the problem. So if you're going to argue that point,
people.
When did man become man?
Well, but again, so the line is people. So here's a question. I'm not trying to get away from this, but to Ryan's thing about evolution, I guess, Jared, my question for you is, aside from human beings, what issue do you have with evolution? And again, I guess I'd have to say aside from death too. I mean, really, what is the problem with the concept of evolution accepting people? Because I've already said that I've got questions about that. But accepting people, what is the issue with evolution?
Are you talking about like a theistic evolution? I guess that's probably what you're talking about.
For me, theistic evolution is just God exists and evolution happened too. I mean, right. It's not like a God is.
I guess my.
No, go ahead.
I guess my point is that looking at Genesis, reading Genesis, is completely contrary to every tenet of evolution. So if God is trying to make some kind of point or trying to present some kind of picture of creation, and is trying to somehow convey the meaning of evolution, or sort of allowing for evolution, he failed miserably because there's no way you can reconcile the two.
And I just don't see that, because if we want to talk about people, then I think we could have a different discussion. But in terms of everything else, animals, plants, I don't see that as a problem, and I don't know that Genesis really addresses that.
Doesn't God say from each from their own kind?
Well,
So dogs, cows.
Well, I mean, you're assigning a meaning to kind. But kind can just mean general categories of animals. I mean, I don't think that's a problem at all. It's. I mean, certainly evolution doesn't say that from dogs are going to come dinosaurs, right? From kind to kind.
Evolution says from a single tiny microscopic organism to humans is what evolution says.
Well, but we all believe we have a common ancestor in Adam and Eve. So again, the idea of common ancestry isn't really an issue.
Yeah, it is. Going from a microscopic cell in mud to me.
Again, no, I'm accept, but remember, I'm accepting humans because, right? I agree that could be problematic for Christian theology. So for animals and all kinds of organic life, other than people, I don't see a problem with that. I don't really see a problem anywhere in Genesis or the rest of the Bible that says that they could not have all come from single-celled organisms. I just don't see that as morally or theologically problematic.
Okay. I mean, I think that the fact that you and I both believe in a creator God keeps us on the same page.
Right.
But because I interpret the Bible, Genesis, literally, and I believe there's a literal 24-hour day,
Sure.
then that can't work.
Sure.
Evolution does not work.
Yeah,
so,
well, right. That's
it's a different
right.
issue.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
Well, I'm saying, this is going to come out terrible, but if a God is employing the amount of power that it would take to create things in 24 hours, who's to say that he couldn't have applied that power to the mechanics of evolution in a 24-hour period? I mean, once you talk about creation in 24 hours, you're throwing out the constraints of the physical world.
Well, you're gonna have to throw out Darwinism.
It's hard to make an application between the two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you can totally, if you want to, call it a special kind of evolution, but it's clearly not evolution the way it's presented by modern science and Darwin. If you're going to say that, because Darwinism implies millions and millions and millions of years from a common ancestor that happened to emerge accidentally through random processes. So if you want to dismiss that,
but that's based on what can be measured now. If you take Darwin's theory on what can be measured now, the way the science works is you're going to then put that over history, assuming that there's no supernatural intervention. If there's supernatural intervention, then all of a sudden all bets are off as far as physical science goes. Am I butchering that too bad?
Then my question to you is, why even go that route? If you're going to dismiss the billions of years that Darwin advocates or neo-Darwinian theory advocates, then why not just say that it happened the way Genesis said it happened? That's way, way easier. I mean, Occam's razor would say simplest solution. Why even go evolution if you're going to talk about 24 hours of evolution?
Well, because it has value in today's world. You know what I'm saying? It helps us to predict things. It helps us to understand the human genome. It helps us. It's a valid scientific theory.
No, it's not, because the way it's employed by scientists is that it's all blind, random processes. Intelligent design, they say that the way things occur is because there is an intelligent creator that is creating these mechanisms for that to happen. But pure Darwinism implies everything is pure chance, pure mutations. So that you can't reconcile the two.
Yeah, so if you find a laptop sitting on the beach, do you think, I wonder if nature just put all that stuff together? Stupid, man.
I'm just saying, I have no problem with...
An intelligent God set things into motion and created a world that had certain rules and boundaries and cause and effect relationships doesn't make him less intelligent.
It doesn't, but I mean, I don't want to make this into an evolution thing, but the way you're defining evolution is completely new. Like, this is not what Darwinism is saying. So my point is, if you're going to create this other crazy evolution story that occurred in 24-hour days, why not just go with what Genesis says?
Well, all I'm trying to do, I'm not actually trying to argue the 24 hours. I'm trying to reconcile it with yours and say that it's possible. I'm not saying it's probable.
Yeah, that's one thing.
Honestly, in general, I'd rather have Jack arguing these because it sounds a hell of a lot more believable.
You know what, Ryan? I don't know how satisfying this will be for you, but I feel like you and I pretty much agree on this.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Ryan's trying to hold it together.
I all but lost my faith in Jesus Christ just then.
I mean, let me say one real quick thing, and then we'll leave the whole evolution thing, away. But there are really brilliant physicists who are operating under the Genesis paradigm, and they're arguing that the universe could have developed requiring billions of years, but through relativity, it's only 24 literal hours on the Earth. So that's kind of a way to bridge the billions of years it takes for light to travel from distant stars to us, and at the same time preserve the Genesis 24 hours. It's very physically possible due to Einstein's relativity. These are very smart guys who are operating under well-established laws of physics, and they're able to bridge that gap. So to me, that defends the idea. Good.
You talking about Matthew McConaughey, Interstellar?
How'd you know? No, not McConaughey. No. But anyway,
isn't that similar to what you're talking about, though?
Sure, yeah. I mean, because time is relative to the observer. So I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of their theory because I don't fully understand it myself. But I've listened to it, read their books, and it makes sense. And that is, an observer at these distant stars would actually observe the billions of years of time. But something on the Earth would actually observe literal 24 hours. And the two can be bridged together through known laws of physics. It's not hocus pocus. So they're arguing real deal science.
We got to be real careful talking about Interstellar because we were doing that on Monday and Ryan had to leave the room because he hasn't seen it yet. And
okay.
I wanted to talk about it and I made him leave.
Please,
I don't want to do that here, but I will.
So what's this excuse? Why haven't you seen it yet? It's been out for a year?
I don't have there's no excuse for me.
All right.
All right, so let's look at the flood. Jack, you how do you read the account of Noah and the flood? And all
catastrophic local flood. Yes.
Yeah. So you do see it as history?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, the idea of a catastrophic local flood doesn't really pose a whole lot of problems of believability.
Right. But so you definitely don't see it as allegorical?
No. And I don't really have a compelling reason to.
Right. Jared, how do you see it?
I would just say that there is a quote unquote flood myth in almost every culture around the world. So to me, it's global. The Bible says it's global. Therefore, I'm just going to believe it's global. And we don't fully understand the mechanisms because we don't know what the Earth looked like 6,000 years ago or whenever it occurred. There could have been vast reservoirs of water. There could have been a canopy. We have no idea. We weren't there. So God could have made it work, based on the way the Earth was back then, for sure. And I believe structures like the Grand Canyon occurred very quickly as opposed to, the millions of years that Darwinists would say, or old Earth people would say. So.
All right, well, let's revisit a comment, Jared, that you made in your opening statement as far as dismissing Genesis having, the potential of opening the door to genocide and just people kind of going crazy, anarchy or whatever. I'm adding words to that. Don't you think, let's say that Genesis shouldn't be taken literally. Doesn't Jesus come in and make that a game changer? And what I mean by that is, all right, so I'm pretty sure Jesus talks about Job, and but to me that doesn't mean necessarily that Job is a historical figure, because that could mean that Jesus has an awareness of the Job story and what it meant to that culture, and everybody listening to him is like, oh yeah, he's talking about that story about Job, not that historical figure. So I do believe that Jesus read the Old Testament, studied the Old Testament, took a lot of stock in the Old Testament, knew that the Old Testament, pointed to him. But doesn't Jesus step into the picture and validate Genesis, but not necessarily a literal interpretation? So in other words, takes away that potential of saying, okay, if Genesis isn't literal, then all hell can break loose.
Yeah, I guess that's not really the point I was trying to make. I think the point I'm trying to make is more of a worldview thing. So, prior to Darwin, it was taken pretty much by most people that God created the heavens and the earth, okay? And they got that from Genesis. But the moment you have Darwin enter the picture, then all of a sudden society started to thinking, okay, this makes sense. We don't really need God anymore because Darwin's mechanisms don't require a God. Therefore, we don't really need to embrace Christianity or theism or whatever because, we don't need that anymore intellectually. So when that happens, then you start having problems like moral relativism, social Darwinism, eugenics, genocide, because then you're starting to say, well, there is no absolute, there's no image of God, so therefore we can impose, our race over another race or whatever. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a Christian problem. I think that's a world problem. And I think that once we separated, from a biblical Genesis type worldview, that opened the floodgates for all the crap that we're dealing with in the 21st and 20th centuries.
I'm going to go to bat for Darwin a little bit here. People were being terrible to each other for a long time before he came around. And certainly a lot of the concepts behind natural selection and evolution did have an impact on, and you've mentioned several times, eugenics in particular. I think that I think you're right in terms of the ways that people have taken that and used it to justify their worldviews. But people take anything to justify their worldviews. I don't know that the 20th century would have been a whole lot better than it was without Darwin and his theory. And also, moreover, the theory of the Big Bang was formulated by a Catholic priest. Catholicism has had no issues with that or with evolution for quite a while. And so, to say that those two things are automatically and entirely opposed to Christianity it's a bridge too far. Like I get what you're saying, but I feel like that's just that. I feel like you're overstating your case to me.
Yeah, I don't think the Big Bang is, okay? But I definitely think Darwinism is, because the tenets of Darwinism, as embraced by a society or culture, okay, it will basically undermine any notion of image of God, absolutes, morals. It basically, basically undercuts all that. So you can't intellectually say, there are no absolutes anymore. There are no morals anymore. There's no God anymore. We don't need a God anymore. We don't need a creator anymore. So I don't think it's all of a sudden one fell swoop, but I think as is adopted over time in a culture, those things begin to happen, and I think we've seen evidence of that. And I also think you're right. There's always been bad guys, but I think the bad guys post-Darwin are able to better rationalize it. And they're saying, well, whatever. There's no morals. I can impose my will however I see fit. I mean, maybe it's a stretch, but that's just how I see it.
Sure.
But I will say a lot of atheists do say that Darwinism was what allowed them to finally be intellectually satisfied atheists.
Sure, yeah.
It's that final thing that allows them to sever any kind of ties with theism.
Sure.
Yeah, but God's never been concerned with convincing people through arguments. He's always told you to have faith in direct opposition to what we see in this physical world.
I agree there, but I think I do. But I think when kids are being quote unquote indoctrinated by Darwinism, they are losing any kind of need or respect for a God. So I think it makes it more difficult. I think you're right. Yeah, sure, it's faith, and God can reveal Himself however He sees fit. But I think it makes it kind of a weird society where we kind of lose that perspective. We lose that creator's perspective or that image of God.
I agree, but I just don't think that God's as threatened by that as we are. I mean, we watch people who lie and cheat and steal get ahead in this world, and that all that does is basically prove to young people that lying and cheating and steal is a more effective strategy in this earth than piety and obedience and humbleness and meekness. So.
Yep.
I just think it's not science's fault. People are just using
I think
justification.
Right, and I think this new atheism has become a religion, and it's built on the precepts of Darwinism. I mean, you can't escape that. I mean, any intellectual atheist will use Darwinism to argue their case. and they're reaching.
I agree,
the
but
youth of
I
today.
think most intellectual atheists, where they fault is not taking physical evidence and trying to draw conclusions of meaning about life. It's quite the opposite. It's taking physical evidence and, well, it's actually, I take that back. It's the exact same. It's using physical evidence to disprove meaning or disprove an intelligent designer, which I don't think that's particularly scientific in and of itself.
Yeah, they're using physical evidence embedded in their worldview. I mean, you could have a creationist taking the same physical evidence embedded in their worldview, and we're talking past each other. So, yeah, it's definitely a worldview, and I think the way it's presented now, it's become almost a religion, where it's not a theory anymore, it's fact. And I know that Joey's probably pissed off right now because it's turned into an anti-Darwinism podcast, which you probably didn't want. So I apologize, and I'll back the hell up. You guys take it from here.
No, this is perfect. So let's wrap it up this way. So obviously, Jack and Jared, y'all read Genesis differently, read it through different lenses. And my question is, and I will phrase it two ways. Jack, how important is it that people read Genesis with a little more open-mindedness as far as, okay, well, maybe this is talking actual facts, maybe this is not. Maybe this, maybe evolution could happen within God's plan, even though Genesis doesn't seem like it, or maybe it's not. Why is that important to consider? And then, Jared, the flip side of that is, why is it important to actually read Genesis with the lenses of, okay, how it's saying happened, this is how it happened? So I'll let whoever wants to go first
I can go first. First of all, Jared, certainly don't feel the need to apologize for how this discussion has gone. I mean, I think it's gone really good, and I've been very pleased with how it's evolved.
Oh, nicely played.
So sorry, guys. I realize that I will now never be invited back or receive eye contact from any of you.
You're a messed up
dude, man. I realize that. So I guess, Joe, to your question, I don't know that is important, that they keep all those things in mind. I think that...
Yeah.
So I remember, different states have, one time or another had sort of the arguments about whether evolution or creationism should be taught in schools, and there's always like one lawmaker or one guy who's like, we can't teach creationism in schools. Like, what if these kids don't learn evolution? I'm like, well, what if he wants to be, an auto mechanic or run a retail store?
Yeah.
I don't care what he believes about that. I mean, right? I took my car in yesterday to the shop, and I wasn't thinking, gosh, I hope this guy believes in evolution, or he's not going to be able to fix it, right? We tend to really overstate the practical relevance of these things for everyday life. And so, my thing when it comes to how people read Genesis, if they are committed to a literal 6-day young earth interpretation, I don't, that doesn't really chafe me. Because I've met plenty of those people who are much closer to God than I am. And, for me, reading the Bible isn't about reading it the right way. Reading the Bible is about being close to God. And it's about learning His heart. And so for me, the way I want people to read the Bible is with a spirit and a mind that is, open to receiving from God what He wants to speak to them. Now, if we're just talking about, I want to study Genesis, I want to say the history and all this, that's for me, that's an entirely different question. Because yes, if you want to study any text in a historical way, then you need to be open to whatever you're going to find. Because if you're not, then you're not studying. All you're doing is confirming your own biases. And so if you want to read Genesis 1 and you're really interested in the history of ancient myth, and you're really interested in what sets the Bible apart, because it is a vastly different ancient document, then you need to be open to whatever you're going to find. And if you're not, then you might as well not study, because all you're going to do is confirm your own biases. So, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. How about you, Jared?
Yeah, I guess for me, I've wrestled with this for probably 10, 15 years. I probably have been old Earth, non-literal Genesis for longer than I have been the opposite. So for me, I can just say that once I finally settled into this camp, I just appreciate the power of God so much more. Not to say that's going to happen to anybody, everybody who does this, but for me personally, I think it's awesome just how absurd it is. Like the absurdity of a universe being created in 6 days, literal 24-hour days, is mind-blowing to me, and I love that about it. And to think that maybe the Earth is only 6,000 years old is mind-blowing and absurd to me, but I love it. It makes me cling more tenaciously to God's Word for being so radical and weird. Secondly, I work with a lot of kids, and a lot of the kids I work with are atheists. And it's so crazy because growing up, a lot of the people I knew were at least culturally Christians or culturally theists, but now the culture, at least in my area, is atheist. And a lot of the reasons why, when you talk to these kids, is because of that there's no need for a creator anymore. So when they're being fed Darwinism, they no longer intellectually need to even, think about a God or a creator God. And I think that came with the post-Darwinian time in history we live in. Okay, so for me, Genesis is about origins, and I think it really is important to really respect where our origins are. So I don't know. Maybe I am stretching it, but I think for me, when I see that we are created by God, that's so powerful. And the fact that God, literally created the universe just for us, I like that idea too. And it didn't take billions of years of animals dying and then randomly mutating and creating another animal. I just like the ideas personally. So maybe it's a bias. I love the idea of this kind of creation in a day. So that's my 2 cents. And again, there are definitely, I respect the old Earth creationists. I respect people who don't read Genesis literally. But for me personally, I love it. I love it as truth. So there you go.
Now, do you think that the unbeliever that's having a hard time coming to God because of science things that he can't, put together and figure out, do you think that maybe it's a wider open door for him to investigate if he hears from someone that says, yeah, I don't necessarily think you have to believe in a young Earth? Like, can you see that?
What, you mean as an apologetic? Like if I was trying to reach a child who was an atheist, would I demand they accept a young Earth? No way. But I would demand, or not demand, but I would definitely suggest, look, we are created by a God, and we are in His image. That would be my first and foremost tactic. But then I could intellectually argue the case for no evolution and for a young Earth. I could argue that intellectually, not just based on faith and stuff like that, but I could appeal to their intellect as well. So, for whatever that's worth, I mean, obviously the Holy Spirit has to reach that person, but as an apologetic, I could do that. So,
yeah. You got something to say, Ryan?
Not really. I mean, to what you're talking about, I guess I would argue that holding tight to a grip of a literal interpretation of Genesis from purely a strategic standpoint could be a stumbling block for unbelievers. And so for that matter, I'm comfortable with loosening my grip. Because I don't see it as a threat to God or God's power. I think whether God created it through some mysterious supernatural force or whether He created it through some mysterious natural selection force, it all came from Him, in my opinion. And He deserves all the credit. And I think if it allows people to get close enough to God and give people, if it allows people not to have an excuse to write off God, then it's worth loosening my grip on that.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for listening. Hope that it has been thought-provoking, and mainly I hope that it's something that you can listen to and really see up close that folks can have common faith and also be on different grounds as far as how they see things, such as the Genesis account. Like, that doesn't have to be an essential position. I would say that probably the four of us, we don't think it's an essential doctrine, as far as how we believe. That's not essential to the faith in Jesus. So thanks for listening, and come back next week.
All right, you were obviously listening to a pastor or the pastor or whatever you want to call it with no answers. We want to thank you. If you want to follow us on Twitter, go to @PWNA Pod. That's @PWNA Pod. I want to give a special shout out to Dan Koch, who provides the intro music that starts these episodes off and ends it at the very end. And if you're interested in him hooking you up with some music, not for free, baby, go to dankoch.net. That's DANKOCH.net. That's our buddy Dan Koch. Go check his website out. Check out his music. He actually does a really good job making stuff that people use, and he's a buddy of ours. So thanks for listening. Feel free to join us at Facebook at facebook.com/BC Pastor. We'll see you guys later. Have a good evening.